Okay. Hello, everyone. Since today's guest lived extensively in China, I thought it would be appropriate to do a blooper from China, which is a sign that had a picture of a camera. And it said very simply in English, the optimum place for shooting. Not exactly the meaning of the word correctly, and what happens, again, when words get misused and why you need professional translation services to make sure that the context is totally correct and things are culturally appropriate. So with that, today's guest is Joshua Halpern. Josh is a former tenured U.S. commercial services officer, effectively a commercial diplomat, serving at the U.S. Embassy in China, where he led the retail portfolio, including the categories of franchises, beauty, and luxury goods, as well as the marine and auto industry portfolios, including Greenport Technology and Advanced Logistics Solutions. He also led trade missions, bringing Chinese port leaders to the U.S. to adopt U.S. Greenport standards and procure U.S. technology and hardware. In addition to lobbying the Chinese government to reduce market entry barriers, he has worked for brands ranging from Revolve, Lime Crime, Steinway Pianos, Mrs. Fields Cookies, Bagla Mishka, Rag & Bone, Bobby Brown, Estee Lauder, and Subway, many of which are household names for most of us. Since 2018, he has won Getting to Global, building private-public partnerships between federal and state trade agencies, local chambers, and Fortune 500 companies to support U.S. merchants and brands selling online and overseas. Partner companies include Google, Facebook, Amazon, FedEx, Payoneer, Avalara, and Digital River. Josh has a strategic partnership agreement with the Small Business Administration and the International Trade Administration to run export training programs for small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses. He holds a BFA from Tisch and an MBA from INSEAD and Tsinghua University, and speaks fluent Spanish and Mandarin. Welcome, Josh. Delighted that you're with us.
Thank you, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So to begin, what advice would you give to U.S. companies that are selling abroad for the first time?
Great question. I think one of the key things I would say is there are all the solutions you need to have your products available and shippable and to get paid for it. You can do it today in a way that you never could before. And when you're analyzing your return on investment of allocating resources to go global, you have to understand that that investment, the I in that ROI, is a lot less than you might think. The number one challenge is going to be building your brand. And that's something that we can talk about separately, but that's what I would say. The big takeaway is you can say yes to global, but you just have to isolate your focus on the marketing side.
And a lot of the marketing you've done involves e-commerce. So I know that a major preparation issues for e-commerce are effectively logistical, sourcing and warehousing and shipping, distribution, and so forth. And these are all before preparing your website and before preparing the actual launch itself, and branding is a big part of that. But is my assumption correct, or are there other issues that I haven't mentioned?
Obviously, you covered the main ones. There's a couple that I would add to it that are overlapping in the stuff that you said, but just to call them out, you've got compliance issues generally. Are you complying with the regulatory bodies there if you're selling nutritionals or organic products or skincare, et cetera? There's definitely the compliance element. Packaging, you have to adjust your packaging vis-a-vis the compliance issue. Your FX rates, just paying attention to a little bit more of are you getting the best FX rates? Once you get to high enough volumes, it can make a real difference.
I'm sorry, you're saying what rates, please?
Sorry, FX. So FX
foreign
rates,
exchange.
kind of, foreign exchange rates.
Right.
You know, obviously, things that can have an impact. As you said, these aren't the critical first steps, but they're important to keep in mind. Duty drawbacks. So how are you going to deal with returns? So in-market customer service and after-sales service is often a major concern. and then of course fraud mitigation issues as well. What I'll highlight though is that as you talked about, what's wonderful about the world, especially a free market, is the harder things are to accomplish or to deal with, the more solutions have come out to address those, because those are the big pain points. And today, more than ever, you have companies that will do that right off the bat.
Solutions to some of these issues that you've mentioned, for example?
Yes, so I don't know if I can, yeah, I can mention brand. I mean, Avalara, for example, is a right off the bat plugin to deal with duties and taxes, and they plug into you if you're selling large volumes and you want to mitigate those issues. You've got a merchant of record model. Again, Digital River or any number of these merchant of record models will take a lot of that off the plate, and they'll essentially act as the merchant of record. They'll take your products and they'll turn around and sell them overseas. But for you, it's essentially a domestic sale. There's a bunch of companies like that. You know, there's a lot of ways to deal with those issues, but they'll basically, you know, the global checkout, so you can make sure you're charging the right duties and taxes. Those are checkout counters that are embedded in your website. If you at this point in time do not have a global enabled website in terms of the currency and your checkout, use any number of tools. Happy to say them. I've already said probably too many brand names to be saying in a podcast, but I do want you to know that there are solutions out there.
And I know that since you've been with the Commerce Department, I'm sure the Commerce Department knows a lot of these tools, or does some person?
Well, the challenge with that is that as a federal agency, you know, they don't necessarily recommend private sector tools, but they know. I mean, we have them as well. I mean, you have them on. We have a platform called export-connect.org, which has all these services. We also have a platform, the Grow Big initiative, where we actually train on all of these aspects at growbig.org/programs. It's all free, but if you go to growbig.org/programs, you can see all these different solutions and what they deal with and what they address. So
that's an excellent resource for people. Thank you. Perhaps similarly, you can tell us what the Commerce Department normally would provide to U.S. exporters, what kind of support they would provide.
Sure. And again, I haven't worked in the Commerce Department for 5 years. We have a partnership with them, but they're probably best known for something called the Gold Key service. If you want to sell overseas, they have offices in 70 of the major markets around the world. They've got an officer who, like I was, oversees local staff, but the real people who know what's going on the ground are the local staff, and they'll be assigned per vertical. So you'll have somebody in retail, somebody in marine industry, finance, etc. You talk to them and you say, hey, I'd like to find 4 distributors or joint venture partners or licensees, and they will use their network and their clout and try to get you those meetings. And you pay a small fee for it, one of the few agencies that charges, but also it provides some feeling of accountability. So that's one of the main things they do. There is another service that I think they should do more of that I think is dependent on availability, but it's the single company promotion, which to me, when you're a US company selling, especially e-commerce, the one thing you can't do with the reach that they have is put your products in the hands of consumers, get feedback, really engage, do a pop-up in a supermarket or do a pop-up in a retail commercial center. They can do that, host an event at a reception at an ambassador or the highest available government official's residence, where you can get these key opinion leaders in. Those are solutions they can do. Depends on whether they want.
Commerce Department, is that right?
That's with the commercial service under the Commerce Department, correct?
And thank you. And that leads to another question I wanted to ask you, which is basically, how do U.S. companies find overseas joint venture partners or find these resources?
Sure.
I think
yeah, that's one of the ways. Now, I would say there's a couple of other creative ways you can do it. Obviously, attending trade shows and talking to associations is key. You know, I find companies that are, let's say you're in the cosmetic space and you want to, obviously you go to, you know, Cosmoprof in Milan or in Hong Kong, etc. But let's say you wanted to go into a country that doesn't have an event, but there's an association of beauty manufacturers or an association of beauty kind of industry leaders. You know, join that association for a few $100 a year in a given country, and then start to understand what's going on there and who's buying what, you know.
Very good. And I know that the Commerce Department is not allowed to recommend, but they do have they have lists of potential contacts, right? So they can't necessarily recommend to
Great
you.
question. You're right. So when you're talking about overseas, for example, like a distributor, they actually, oddly enough, they can when it's an overseas company. I think the idea is they can't show favoritism within the US. They have a service provider list, which is essentially a pay to play, but for the US, which I don't think is the best list. But we're overseas, you actually say, I want to meet the best distributors in my product vertical, and they will introduce you to those distributors. Now, the best way to take effect is to actually come with a prepared list of, hey, I'd love to meet these people or these organizations. Could you use the embassy and reach out to them? That's probably one of the most efficient ways to do it.
Fascinating. Back a bit to e-commerce, which is one of your specialties. There are two kinds of e-commerce, one for effectively the very large companies that people know about, Amazon and so forth, but then also for smaller companies. So does e-commerce differ, or does strategy shift according to industry, for example?
Yes, it does. You know, obviously, if you're talking about, you know, beauty or nutritionals, there may be a benefit for you to go direct to consumer. Whereas if you're talking about, you know, something like maybe in an apparel space, it might not be as beneficial. To give you an example, if you're selling into China, for example, and you want to sell skincare and you don't want to have animal testing, there are certain regulations in China. Some of them have been lessened to some degree recently, but in general, they will require animal testing if you're wholesale importing. But if you're going to an individual consumer, that technically the consumer assumes the risk. And so you can actually sell direct to that consumer vis-a-vis cross-border. So placing your inventory in Hong Kong, or in some cases even in LA, Delaware, Oregon, et cetera. And you can actually place it into the hands of the consumer without actually having to get animal testing, without adjusting your pricing, without adjusting even your organic, for example, labeling if you're dealing with food products, because it's cross-border. So there's definitely different strategies depending on how your your product category and your issues with compliance.
And does this apply worldwide or specifically for China, for example?
It's not worldwide, per country basis. I believe Europe has some piece of that as well that they do. Brazil to some degree, but there's some challenges. Mexico has kind of blocked some of that as well. What it really comes down to is certain countries have said, look, there's so many small parcels that we're never going to get to all of these. Let's kind of make it more possible let's lessen the burden of us to oversee some of this. I think that's more of probably a driver, but certain countries will do it, certain won't. So you really got to look at that. And we do that for our companies as well. Yeah.
Are there any specific issues that, I mean, you're talking about sort of shipping and certain regulations and so forth, but are there other issues that may be country specific or industry specific?
Yeah. So for example, let's see. Well, with apparel, you know, one of the issues we have, you know, if you're selling, let's say, something with fish and wildlife concerns, right? If you have a collar that you had no idea was actually made with fibers from some sort of animal of sorts, you may find yourself blocked in that export if you haven't registered it properly or had the right certifications. I would say in general, the flow is, if you're a seller, there's a lot of people out there who are going to scare people into saying there's all these unique regulations and these things you got to look at. But at the end of the day, you're selling a product online. You have a 3PL, so a third-party logistics provider who will probably take it for you, then aggregate it possibly at a port if you're a smaller company, or you do it yourself, and then ship it over to that given market direct to the consumer. That's like kind of a first phase. When you're doing that, the 3PL is going to do it. Now, ultimately, they're not responsible. Arguably, you are. But if you find the right ones and you vet them, they're going to take care of it. So you don't have to be on top of this all the time. Shopify is a perfect example of it. Shopify has taken every part of that vertical and tried to slowly cut away all the service providers and do it themselves under the Shopify brand. Shopify, they have pay, they've got logistics, they've got a duty checkout counter, they've got the ability to launch products on different marketplaces. So slowly but surely, the merchant is not going to have to worry about all these things we talk about when us fun people like to talk about trade and how complicated it is and how smart we are to know this. The truth is, you don't have to know this. You have to know how to build your brand and find your tribe.
And building your brand internationally can be difficult, to say the least, depending on the country or the target market.
Absolutely. I would say that it's not as difficult as it was in the past. I mean, if you were to say to somebody in, pre-internet, if you were to say, hey, how do I build my brand overseas? Where do I go? Who's buying what? What's going on? Right now, there's a bunch of tools where you can actually search a marketplace in a given market, and you can say, here are the products that are similar to mine. Here are the brands that are selling it. Here's the price points they're selling at. Here are the volumes at which they're selling. And here is where all their traffic is coming from on their own website. It's crazy. I mean, if you thought about that in the world of the main street and you said, hey, I've got this great butcher shop, but how come Johnny's selling so much more? And you walk down the street, you're like, gosh, where are these people coming from? You'd have to have somebody sit down in a chair, ask everybody questions every time they get in the door. You actually have that right now. It's a remarkable world, but you've got to focus on it, and your culture and your company has to be aligned so that when you're sitting in a meeting saying, hey, where's our traffic coming from? 20 minutes of that time is spent saying, well, let's look at it beyond the US. Where is it coming from? How come we all of a sudden got this uptick on Instagram in France? And then you look and you say, oh, there's two of these influencers who keep riffing back and forth on how cool it is to have a checkered scarf when they're walking on the Eiffel Tower. I don't know. You start to look at that and say, oh, maybe there's an opportunity.
It's fascinating. Does e-commerce differ? I know you speak Spanish and obviously studied in INSEAD, which is the primary business school in Spain. And I believe you've done some work in Mexico. So when you're dealing e-commerce in Latin America, are there any strategies that are different from Asia or any other part of the world that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so if I were to compare China and Latin America, I think there's if you're saying, comparing those two markets would be interesting. It's a lot more costly to build your brand in China than it is in Latin America. The competition for mind share in China is probably some of the most expensive in the world, because you have every major brand in the world who for the last 10 years have rushed into China. The consumer market there is huge, but it's also very different from the way we do business, and the social media kind of entities are different. So it's very costly to get anywhere in China. So where Latin America, there's a ton of arbitrage and keyword spend in Latin America, because people are not spending as much as they are in the US or elsewhere on Google and Facebook. So I think you can get very far. And I guess the other issue is pricing, right? As a US exporter, for example, our products tend to be a little bit more expensive. Even if you're sourcing in China, somebody's got to make the margin. What we do best is add a margin on top of things that someone else makes. So you can do that, but in Latin America, China's in there directly, and they're selling on Mercado Libre, and they're selling on Amazon and elsewhere. So you've got to compete with a pretty aggressive group there. It's odd because Latin America has become a proxy battleground for China and the US in terms of consumer sales.
Very interesting. Yeah. In a similar vein, I guess, there are certain products that appeal very much to the American market. Now, I mean, Harley Davidson is a great example. Their brand image, as you're talking about brands, is sort of machoism and individualism and rebellion and independence and freedom and so forth. And those values do not work well in other cultures that are either authoritarian or group-oriented cultures, or where the countries don't have wide open roads as we do, for example. So when a brand wants to take itself to other countries and it's US values don't convert well, how do they do that? Or have you seen examples of how they've done that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great thing. I just comment that I also represented Harley Davidson as part of the auto portfolio in Beijing. And so we actually did lobby the Chinese government to allow Harley to exist inside the third ring road. So there's ring roads in Beijing. Oddly enough, you can't go anywhere. Even in a Harley, you can't get around traffic in the third ring road. And it was tough because the truth is, the Chinese didn't want the Harleys in there because they were loud and they were disruptive, and they also had people who didn't follow the rules, as well. So it was an interesting market barrier to explore when you don't realize as Harley you're going to run into those issues. Oddly enough, in terms of consumers, there was a nuance of similarity because even though you don't have the muscle-bound kind of Harley, not that everybody who drives a Harley is this way in the US even, but you actually did have a fair amount of machismo, but instead of muscles, it might have been bank accounts where it was very expensive to have a Harley. So you'd have people, revving up through the wealthy areas, just showing off their Harleys and seeing how many things they could add on to their Harleys in terms of tweaking them. Where I think there's a misconception probably is, Harley's not going to sell there because people don't want they're loud and they're expensive stuff. There's a tribe everywhere, and your tribe, quite frankly, probably exists in most countries. It might be much smaller in a country, or it might be looking for a very different thing. But the question you have to ask yourself is my tribe big enough in that given market, and can I penetrate it easily enough to warrant me going in? Not necessarily is that country's market big enough. So that's a different layer. Answering your question, which I haven't really answered in terms of how do you adjust, example with DeBeers and diamonds, is I think a famous case study where in Japan, love was not related to diamonds, and they've done a wonderful marketing of associating diamonds with a show of love. So you had a lot of challenges for the first few years of them coming out, and then I think they started to realize, a young female executive, and you probably know this actually because you were in Japan, you have roots. The young female executive, when she arrives, kind of buys herself a diamond. There was a lot of that kind of feeling, and I think that happened also in China, only probably a decade later, because they also don't even believe that marriage and love necessarily have to be equated with each other. Things that are very different than we take for granted in the States as assumed.
It's fascinating. And what did DeBeers do in Japan? They
went after the young female executives.
Okay.
And
are you saying they bought themselves the diamond rings?
Yeah, it was like the advertisements around like the girl who's got, or the young lady who has her friends sitting around. She's got her diamond, and she's got her briefcase, and she's kind of, in the corporate world. There's no man in sight. There's none of that element that we seem to have added, or they've added for us here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it was not tied to marriage, of course.
Right. There's love and diamonds. Love, diamonds, and marriage are three things that do not necessarily go together. I find in Asia, there's a lot more pragmatism around relationships.
Right.
So you have a partnership with somebody. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to love them. What does that have to do with it? My friends in China would often say that. Like they'd say Americans are like children. They smile too much. They think things are so magical, and they have this romantic view that clouds their judgment. And I would smile and then walk away.
No, that's fascinating. It reminds me of it's a totally separate subject, but I also lived in Africa, and young African children. Some friends of mine were teachers, of kindergartners in Black African schools. The teachers were white, and the students couldn't differentiate the white teachers. And she said, "Well, can't you tell? I've got blonde hair; she has black hair." And the student said, "Oh no, ma'am. You white people all look alike. You all look like dead fish." So it's a very different perception.
Well, yeah, I say it's kind of like classical music. If you don't listen to it often, it kind of sounds like similar, and then you listen to it long enough, and you're like, oh, I totally get the differences. And yes, being 7 years in Beijing, I get used to people. I'm not offended. I look exactly the same.
Right.
So
That's funny. On the subject of China, China's, of course, become a very controversial country now in
yeah.
the United States and the world. The perception is that it's a bully and very overbearing and certainly a political rival. So many countries are exiting China to put their supply chains elsewhere, and others still are entering China. What advice can you give to companies that are both entering China and others that are leaving China?
Yeah, I think it's a sad state of affairs. Frankly, it's very frustrating because you see, humans, I think, fundamentally want the same things, but our governments and our economies force us into these positions, and then before we know it, we don't know why we're not liking each other, but we aren't, and we're at that place where we do not like each other. And luckily, there are enough people who have worked internationally on the China side, the U.S. side, that know that there's great people on all the sides. But I do think this is here to stay. I don't think that China and the U.S. have any reason to find a way back to complementary existence, mostly because we're essentially teenagers seeing each other as rivals, and we're not going to get any less of a rival. We're puffing our chests, and we're going to cause a lot of challenges going forward. I'd love to believe it's wrong. I'd love to be wrong, but from a commercial standpoint, when you're doing business in China, there's absolute truth to the fact that people do reflect in their purchasing what the government and the general sentiment is. If you're not a known brand, that almost supersedes the US, or Europe less so. But if you have a US luxury brand, if you're big enough, great. But if you're coming in for the first time, and a consumer has an option of a French luxury good or a US, I think in general, they're going to avoid US products. So I think it's harder, and it was already pretty hard. It's expensive. So my word is, bring a ton of money if you have to go in, and hold it close to your chest, and make sure you know who the partner is, and make sure you're constantly giving value, which was the case 5 years ago. But I always say to companies, it's not personal, but your relationship will cease to exist the moment you stop adding value on a day-to-day basis. The Chinese merchant or the Chinese business partner will consistently reevaluate whether it's useful to be in a contract with you. And I say contract loosely because they don't mean it as, oh, they've written something. They mean, should I still do business with you? Are you still adding value? And so a lot of companies, when they're going in, they will isolate their SKU sets, so they won't necessarily sell their most recent line. And if a distributor wants that recent line, they're going to have to work for it. And when they get it, there's still another thing. You have to have a deep bench. So you've got to keep that power dynamic. And it feels a little crass. I think for Americans, we tend to feel like, hey, we figured out we trust each other. We're working really well together. Here are my cards. Let's just work transparently. It takes a little longer to do that, I think, in a healthy way than it would here.
And what about companies leaving China? Do you see the exodus?
U.S. companies, foreign Western companies?
Yes.
I see a massive exodus. Most of the people, I went to business school in Seattle, as you know, which is actually a French at Singapore, and then there's Tsinghua has the campus there, but it was a joint program. So we had a lot of Westerners in mainland China. I would say 90% of them have left. The ones that have stayed are working for U.S. companies that are still there. One of the biggest things that happened, I want to say, in the last couple of years, and I'm sure somebody will have a more specific answer to this, but the Chinese tax law for expats changed. And when you ask, like, oh, well, they don't like foreigners anymore and stuff like that, how does that really work? Well, here's an example. They decided to tax expats not only on their salaries, but on the value of the rental that they lived in, even if company was paying for it. So now all of a sudden, somebody who had an expat package and is living in Shanghai at $5,000 or more a rent plus their salary, they're getting taxed on that whole amount. So that sent many people out. But there's a lot. I mean, my friends who have said that there's been lots of aggression. I was there right before the Olympics, so there was a definite different dynamic. Everyone's open up. Everyone's excited to meet the world. It's not the best environment now for a lot of them. And then for doing business, you know, there used to be, if a U.S. and a Chinese company come up against each other and neither one of them is a state-owned enterprise, and they have the right paperwork, they could have a reasonable chance of the U.S. company of arguing in their favor. Technically, on the books, that's probably still the same, but I think there's a lot more bias, all things being equal.
Very fascinating. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close, or perhaps to tell us about what Grow Big does?
Sure. You know, look, I've spent my time trying to help companies figure out how to go global through e-commerce, not just to China, but everywhere. We built out a platform to do that and called the Grow Big Initiative at growbig.org. The idea is to help companies figure out the pieces of the puzzle, not just government agencies and associations and private sector, all of them. And then I do the Van Ambassador, which is an outcropping of me commuting every week from Mexico City, where my wife and my son were when my wife was with the embassy there, to California. So I was interviewing brands on the road about how they're staying local and going global. So if you want to check it out, it's called the Van Ambassador, guy in a van talking about global expansion for those digital nomads out there. So that's on vanambassador.com or YouTube on Van Ambassador or Instagram. That's great. That's my spiel.
Very good. Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating episode with Joshua Halpern, and thank you so much for joining us.
Philip, it is a pleasure. I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you. And I hope you will all join us next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.